Okay, scholars. This is the second part about the Articles of Confederation and the Constitution. Gotta get my coffee for the day. All right, the Articles of Confederation. We talked about the fact that they were, it seemed to be a static document, which we will see shortly. But this is what they wanted. They wanted a league of states with a rotating personnel. They wanted no executive, no king, no president, no tyrant. They didn't want anybody to exercise executive power. They didn't want this body to be able to tax. They wanted unanimous consent for any kind of change or modifications to the document. They didn't want it to be able to be changed willy-nilly. Now, during the war, that was fine. Because the primary concern of the central government was maintaining the military and the Navy and making sure that the Army and everything was passed. This was not a legislative body. It was an administrative body, okay, for the central government, which is basically, even though they're referred to as a legislative branch, they had no power to initiate legislation, no jurisdiction. Okay, so after the war, all right, after the war was over, the day-to-day operations of this group, this central government, was hampered because nobody wanted to be involved with it. Okay, lack of quorum would stop them from holding meetings. A quorum for this assembly was at least 7 states had to be represented, with at least 2 delegates per state. That means if 6 states had a full delegation and 1 state only had 1 person, they couldn't do business. The lack of quorum would stop them from functioning, because it doesn't require a simple majority of the people present. It requires an absolute majority of 7 out of 13 votes in order for business to be done. Okay, the best delegates, the most important legal thinkers of the day, were busy in their state governments, because it's in the state governments that each of these states is creating a constitution. That's where the legislatures are. The Articles of Confederation was predicated on a central government being administrative, whereas the state governments were sovereign and was the legislation creating bodies. And so that creates a problem. Okay, young bachelors like Madison are heavily invested in the notion that something needs to be done. And for 4 years we exist under these conditions of this weak central government that doesn't even have the power to force a state to pay its fair share when it comes to the notion of taxation. Okay, old family men like Samuel Adams, these people will be involved in the day-to-day operations of the central government. But again, it was not a legislative branch. It was more of an administrative branch. The rest were there for the short term. Many do not even want to be there. Okay, they appreciated the fact that they could only serve 3 years out of 6, so that they had a time limit, because most of the most important legislatures of the day wanted to be in their state governments where actual political activity was taking place. Okay, now, again, the good ones were spending all their times in the states. One element that your textbook pointed to was Shays' Rebellion as an indication of how weak the Articles of Confederation were. During this period, Daniel Shay is a lawyer in Massachusetts. When it comes time to do their fair share in the political arena, the people in the western part of Massachusetts wound up paying the majority of the taxes for the state of Massachusetts, because the tax burden was tied to an idea of land ownership. So in the eastern part of Massachusetts, the idea was that most of the people who lived in the east didn't own any land, even though they were the wealthiest members of Massachusetts society. So Daniel Shea, the way we've always dealt with taxes we didn't agree with, they refused to pay. They avoided the tax, and when the tax collectors started coming, they would tar and feather the tax collectors. That's how we've always dealt with taxes we thought were unfair. And so they actually comes to a point to where they take up arms. So during Shea's rebellion, for over a year, there's fighting going on in the western part of Massachusetts. When the central government is asked to activate the militia to put down Shea's rebellion, in order to do anything like that, you would have to have 9 delegations present. They couldn't get 9 delegations present to vote whether the central government would authorize the military to go and put down Shea's rebellion. Many of the more southern states would say that sounds like a Massachusetts problem to us. And so Shea's rebellion shows that the central government was powerless to enforce any laws, any regulations. Now, all of that being said, during the war, the Articles of Confederation was probably the best government we could have had. And it's because of this. The way the British would normally fight a war, they would go into an area and they would find the political center, and they would quash that political center, and then it puts to rest the political entity that they were fighting against. Even if the British government were able to capture all of the members of this Continental Congress, even if they were able to capture all of those members, it would not have stopped the war, because the actual legislative power during the American Revolution was vested in the states. The state governments were the ones that were the most important. Okay, so their purpose was to make sure the army is maintained and things like that. But it was once peace came about, the idea that this central government was no longer going to be effectual. And so many people decided that there had to be a change. There had to be, they needed to revise these Articles of Confederation. Now, in 17, the Articles were powerless. A small group of Virginia delegates came to the meeting, and they decided to call a meeting to revise the trade regulations in the Articles of Confederation. When they do this, they're going to get more than they bargained for. In 1786, they are planning a reworking of the national government, a complete reworking, a more complex document, but a document which has a central government that has clearly defined jurisdictions, and is able to enforce these jurisdictional rules, as we'll see here shortly. Okay. Now, Madison leads this group. He petitions the committee to call for delegates to meet in Annapolis with the express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. That means we need a majority. We need everybody, all 13 delegations, to show up. Well, in September 1786, only 5 states send delegations. Only 5 states. They can't even do regular business, because regular business required 7 states. So they reschedule for May 1787, and instead of Annapolis, Maryland, they're going to meet in Philadelphia. They're going to meet in Philadelphia. They send out letters to each of the state legislatures saying you must appoint people to your delegations that are going to be faithful and appear and show up for the purpose for which they're called, with the sole and express purpose of revising the Articles of Confederation. This was the letter. And so that next year, 1787, the delegation comes forward. Now, one member has other plans. I usually refer to him as Dr. Evil, but I won't do that today, even though Dr. Evil. Alexander Hamilton, James Madison have both been working on a plan for a stronger central government. Okay, Madison is the architect of this this federal system, this layered system of national government, state government, and local municipalities over the people. Okay, Hamilton is a strong supporter of this more powerful central government. Hamilton himself, 1773, he had attended King's College in New York. In 1777, he joins George Washington's staff as one of his basically like a chief of staff. Hamilton fears what most people would refer to as democratic disorder. Democratic disorder. So in 1787, 55 men meet in Philadelphia. There are a few dissenters present. Patrick Henry, for one, a very staunch supporter of the Articles of Confederation, gets up from the meeting and walks out. He says, "I think I smell a rat," because he believes the Articles of Confederation should stand the way they are. Patrick Henry will be one of the authors who responds to the individuals who write the Federalist Papers. The vast majority of the Federalist Papers are written by Hamilton, Madison, and John Jay. Patrick Henry will be one of the respondents in what are called the Anti-Federalist Papers. If any of you are heading for a job, law school, or government at all, these are two sets of documents you should read. So Patrick Henry believed right off the bat that something was going on, and he didn't want any part of it. Benjamin Franklin recognized also that something was going on, but he also recognized the fact that the reason they were called together was to revise trade regulations, not to rebuild a whole new government. So Franklin rationalizes this meeting. Franklin says, what we need to do is have a discussion on what a more perfect union might look like. Okay, this idea that this more perfect union could be theoretically hashed out in theory. Okay, so officially they're not looking to overthrow the government. Officially they are looking theoretically at what a more perfect union would look like. George Washington will preside over the meeting. He's not the president yet. It's just presiding over the meeting, which means he holds the hammer. The rest are new people, young bloods. Now, the convention, according to Franklin's recommendation, works in secret. They even nailed the windows shut. And they work from May until September, so through the summer. They nail the windows shut, they post guards outside, they post guards inside, the doors are closed. Every scrap of paper produced in that room stays in the room. No one is allowed to discuss things with newspaper people or people outside of that room. This theoretical discussion is going to take place, but it has to take place in secret, Franklin said. And so that's what they do. When the discussion begins in earnest, Virginia steps forward with a plan, being led by Madison. It's a 15-point plan to restructure the entire government in this new federalist layered concept. Okay, it's primarily the work of Madison, James Madison. It rejected this idea of a confederation of sovereign states. It proposes three branches of government, each with checks and balances on each other. It adds a chief executive to this mix, and it adds a national judiciary, as we will look at later. However, in the Virginia plan, representation in both houses of this bicameral assembly, bicameral means two houses of Congress, rather than the unicameral assembly that they currently had. Okay? Representation would be by population. So the more populated your state is, the more representation you got. So the upper house and lower house would both have the number of people based on how much population each state has. Now the small states recognized that their voice was going to be quelched, that the large, most populated states would be able to just walk all over them. So the small states are going to reject this idea. Now, another thing, Congress would be able to veto state laws. We call it a supremacy clause, that federal law supersedes state laws. And it would allow the central government to force the state militias to obey the commanders of the central government. The executive and the judiciary could both veto acts of Congress. The executive could veto an act when it came to his desk. The federal judiciary could veto those acts once they become law, if they're declared unconstitutional. Now, the plan brought up in opposition to this because of the notion of representation based solely on population comes from New Jersey, referred to as the New Jersey Plan. All the small states were supporting, all their delegations supported this idea. New Jersey, Connecticut, Delaware, New Hampshire, they supported the idea of having a different method of establishing representation. They wanted the assembly to look more like the Articles of Confederation, right? A single house of Congress, a unicameral assembly with an executive office. However, instead of a single person, it would be three persons, three men elected from the Congress itself to serve as the executive. I guess the closest thing we can see would be like in England. Whenever England has an election, the Parliament votes for a prime minister, and that person would be the head of the government in this section. Well, this is sort of the idea that the Congress would have the ability to appoint these three men to serve as the executive for the government. It gave the Congress sweeping powers, the ability to tax, regulate trade, to use force on state governments. Both supported a need for a new system of government. Both groups recognized that the Articles of Confederation were weak and they were static, and they did not allow the country to move forward. Even though they have different ideas, these two plans are going to be debated. The vast majority of what's going on during this period is with regard to debating these two plans. Okay? They debate these two plans for the next 2 weeks. The small states will not accept two houses of Congress if both houses are staffed based on population. And Madison rejects out of hand the notion that it's one state, one vote. As you can see, this idea seems to be, they seem to be diametrically opposed to one another. But the compromise, as referred to in your text, the Great Compromise, is based on representation, is going to come about in a bicameral assembly, okay? A bicameral assembly, two houses of Congress, with representation by population in the lower house, which is the House of Representatives, and then represented by state in the upper house, which would wind up being two independent votes, okay? And so the idea is that in order for a law to pass, through Congress, it has to go through the direct representation of these more populated states, but then the law has to pass the Senate, where there is a 2 votes per state. So it has to pass both houses before a law can be sent to the president's desk. So representative by individuals, representative by state. So the small states feel that they have an equal voice, but however, the vast majority of the population feels they have a voice because they have more representatives in the Congress. Now, once this thing is settled, the big question becomes, who counts for population? What about slaves? Well, the southern states say, well, that's great, we got plenty of population. And the northern states say, oh no, you can't count your slaves. And the slave states say, why not? And they say, because you're not going to let them vote. So therefore you can't count them as population. And the southern states say, oh, okay. Then they ask the question, are you going to count your women in population? And the northern states say, well, of course we are. And then they say, are you going to let them vote? And they're not. So the second debate that takes place in this event is this thing that comes out being called the 3/5 clause. Okay? So what you wind up with in the Constitution is a clause in Article 1 dealing with population. It basically says something to the effect of, when establishing populations of the varied states which now are, you shall count all free persons plus 3/5 of all other persons, excluding Indians. One of the most often repeated phrases in the Constitution is the short phrase, excluding Indians. This is not the first time, or not the last time, the Constitution will deal with the institution of slavery. The 3/5 clause, which basically says for every 5 slaves in a state, they can count 3 for population purposes. They can count 3 for population purposes. The other 2 places where slavery is dealt with is, even though the word slave and slavery is not mentioned, the institution is dealt with twice. The trade regulations, as a power of Congress. So in Article 1, the second place that you have mentioned the issue of slavery is in the trade regulations, where it says, and you've got to follow the legal conversation here, the migration or importation of such persons as any of the states now shall think proper to admit shall not be prohibited by the Congress prior to the year 1808, which in regular English says that the Congress will not pass any laws regulating the institution of slavery until 1808. What happens? Basically what they're saying is for the next 20 years, slave trade will be allowed to continue on unabated with no restriction. The third place is in what's called the Fugitive Slave Clause. The Fugitive Slave Clause, which is in Article 4 of the Constitution, the part dealing with state-to-state interactions. No person held to service or labor in one state, under the laws thereof, escaping into another, shall, in consequence of any law or regulation therein, be discharged from such service or labor, but shall be delivered up on claim of the party to whom such service or labor may be due. Basically it says, if a slave runs away from the state of Georgia to the state of Illinois, the slaveholder can go to Illinois and retrieve his property. So what you've got buried in the Constitution, okay, and I believe there are reasons why the Southerners instituted made such a point of adding these things to the Constitution, simply because when Thomas Jefferson's plan for the Northwest Ordinance, which forbade the expansion of slavery into the northern states, they recognized that their institution was in danger. So these southern delegations made sure that not only was the institution of slavery recognized as legitimate, but the sub-citizen status, 3/5 clause of the slaves were recognized as legitimate. The institution was guaranteed to continue unabated and for the next 20 years, and the institution was protected by the Constitution, that even if a slave goes into a free state, that the Constitution recognized that slave as still being property. Which is why, whenever we get closer to the end of the semester, the question about slavery, how do we get rid of slavery? There's only one way to get rid of slavery. You have to amend the Constitution. The Constitution had it entrenched. The Constitution has to be amended in order for slavery to go away. That's the idea. Okay? Now,
It's